It's May 3rd, 2026, and this is Amy, and we're going to talk with Mom today. And the original kind of prompt was to think of 5 to 7 people that had some kind of significant influence in our life. And she's modified the prompt just a little bit so that she's going to talk about also some influential events. Okay. So she has a list and she'll get started and we'll just have a conversation.
All right. So one of my earliest memories, because it was such a national thing, was when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And I just remember how that affected people. And I think that's one of the reasons I've always been so patriotic, and I always stand when the flag goes by, and I always put my own flag out every morning and bring it in at night when there's no lights on it. And it's not just the flag, but it's just patriotism in general. And I like learning about our country's history. But I think all of that was started, those feelings, when Kennedy was assassinated.
How old were you?
Let's see, that was 1963, so I was 8. And then his brother, Bobby Kennedy, was assassinated on my birthday when I was about 12 or 13.
When he was running for president?
Let's see, it was still the 60s, wasn't it, when he was running for president, so I wasn't quite that old. But anyway, I always felt a certain pride for the Kennedys, and
there were 3 assassinations that summer.
And
Jim has been asked not to interrupt, but he can't help himself.
I know.
Okay,
so anyway, that's...
So then, when you first heard about it, or was there anything that you remember that people in your community or anyone did to commemorate it? Did you hear it about on the radio or the news?
I remember my mom cried. I remember that's all adults talked about, like, for a few days. And of course it was on the news over and over again, because it was one of the first times event like that was actually televised. And
the actual shooting?
Yeah, the actual shooting. They were in a motorcade in Texas, and the camera was on his car with Jackie and John in it, and it shows him getting shot. And her response, and everybody around him's response, and it was actually, I think, a personal video camera. It wasn't a news camera. As I recall, it was a personal person who was videotaping for his own uses. And of course, they used it
over and over.
Yeah, but anyway, so I love my country. Let's that get put on the record.
All right.
So the other thing that kind of influenced my personality, which is to try to be religious anyway. When I was about 14 or 15, I had my own bedroom downstairs in the basement. I had a radio in my bedroom, and every Sunday night at 10 o'clock, I listened to Master Control. Nobody else in the family even knew about it or what it was, but it was a radio program, national broadcast program, about how to be like Jesus, and and that's what master meant, was the master is Jesus, and how to live your life like Christ-like.
Was it just like one preacher saying his views, or was it different people? What was the format?
I don't remember. I think there was one narrator that was always on, but I think there were other people that told their stories. anyway,
And do you remember if it had a certain denomination
no,
affiliation?
it was non-denominational, as far as I knew. It definitely wasn't LDS, but was Christian. And then I also had a really good Sunday school teacher that I liked. He was our former bishop, and I used to babysit for him and his wife. And then when he was not bishop anymore, he was our Sunday school teacher. And we were a rowdy group, lots of girls, only one boy and 10 girls in our Sunday school class. And the girls were always talking and being disrespectful, but I wouldn't. I would always sit quiet and listen, even as a teenager, to him specifically, because I just thought he was really wise. And
What was his name?
Bishop Millar. I can't remember his first name because he always went by Bishop. Anyway, so there's kind of that side of me that tries to be religious, and then I think part of that goes back to this other thing I mentioned, or that I recall. And I don't know how early you are when you realize there are days of the week, that there's some order to, it's not just day after day after day and nothing's different. There's actually days of the week, and they have names, and there's a weekend, and you're probably 3 or 4 years old when you figure that out. And then also the months of the year, you learn those, and those things meant order. They meant there's not control necessarily,
predictability.
but there's like, this is going to happen, and then this will happen next, and this will happen next. And it's like, the way I applied that in my personal life is things belong in certain places, and that's where they belong. And it's good to have that kind of structure and order in your life. It's important. So
Mostly just the days of the week or the year?
well, then I really loved the multiplication table, and not just memorizing and repeating it, but seeing it written down. I would sit and draw a graph and get the lines in there, 81 squares, and fill in. Maybe I even went to 12 squares and did up to 144. But I just liked the structure and the order of numbers. And I noticed David was like that when he was a tiny kid. His favorite thing was the children's friend would come, and he'd look for the calendar. Before he even knew how to read, he'd look for the calendar in the children's friend. So there's something about things being lined up. And I guess that applies over into quilting and sewing blocks and rows and making them really neat and orderly. And give that man a pair of scissors.
Well, I think he just wanted to make sure that we know he's here, so that's fine. The sound effect background is our father, and he's opening the mail. So you had faith and country, and the order to the universe so far.
Oh boy, I don't know about the universe.
Just order.
There's just way too much to even think about the order in the universe, but definitely in my life, I like to have things in their place, You wouldn't know that necessarily to walk in my house at times. It might look messy sometimes, but I always feel a real good feeling of accomplishment if my bed is made and clothes are put away. And
my favorite phrase is outer order, inner calm.
Yeah,
When things are
that's a good one.
orderly, yeah. I feel calmer.
So, as far as people, I think, are we okay? I think I had a school teacher that really influenced me, that I'll always remember, and her name was Mrs. Heath.
How do you spell it?
Heese, and she was my fourth grade teacher. And the one thing I remember about her is in that small LDS community, she was not LDS. And
Did she drink coffee?
Of course, she knew that. Not in school, I don't think, but she probably did. I didn't know her outside of school. But in my classroom, we had 4 classes of every grade. So there was 4 fourth grade classes. And I was just one of 100 other fourth graders. And in my family, I was right in the middle, one of 6 kids. And just nobody special until I was in her class. And then all of a sudden, I was special. And I don't know if she made just me feel that way or if she just knew how to make every student feel that way. I think I was her teacher's pet, that I was the one she would ask to hand out stuff or gather up stuff, and just the way she would talk to me sometimes. That was the year I started wearing glasses, and I hated them. I just thought they were so ugly, and they probably were. But the first day I went to school wearing my glasses, I wouldn't come out of the cloak closet. I just hid in there, and she finally came in and got me and told me I looked okay, and now I could see the board better, and it was good to have glasses. And anyway, she also taught me to love books. Every day you'd go to lunch, then you'd have a recess, you'd come in so tired, and she'd sit us all down quietly and start reading to us. For half an hour every day, she read to us. She read Charlotte's Web. She read Island of the Blue Dolphins. Those are the only 2 books I remember, and it might have taken all year to read those 2 books, but there might have been more. But after that, I just always wanted books, and that's when I discovered our city had a little library. Although I don't think I ever had a library card. I went in the library, but I don't think I ever borrowed books from it. But in junior high, or maybe even in 6th grade, you'd get these little flyers, all the students would, that was books you could order, just cheap paperbacks, and I always ordered from them. Sometimes I'd get one of those thin paperbacks, take it home, and read it all in one night. And then I'd be sad I didn't have anything else to read. But I definitely learned to love to read books because of her.
And it was Mrs. Heese.
Yeah.
Mrs. Heese.
Yeah. And
How old do you think she was when you had her?
Well, I know her daughter was in the class younger than me. So she was probably in her 30s. And the 2 years later, or 3 or 4 years later, Stacy had her. And I ran into Mrs. He somewhere, and she said, "Oh, I have Kathryn too in my classroom." And I thought, oh, she's got another girl named Kathryn in her classroom.
She meant Stacy.
What she meant was my sister. Anyway,
So Mrs. Heese.
that was reading and books and Mrs. Heese. And I had to say, one of the biggest influences in my life was my mom and dad, and how much they loved nature and camping. And we always went on one camping trip every summer for a whole week. Dad would take Dad had 2 weeks of vacation every year. 1 week he would use for scout camp, and 1 week for family camp. And we camped all over Idaho. And Mom was really good at knowing the names of flowers and birds. She'd recognize bird calls and what kind of bird it was. And
You guys would camp in tents?
yeah,
Or a
always
tent?
tent camping. And our ward, we used to have a ward outing, and we went camping up in Island Park.
Always to there?
Well, I remember doing it a couple of times. It was at Buttermilk Campground, right on the reservoir, couple of people in the ward had boats, and we'd go out boating. And one thing that happened at one of those campouts when I was a young teenager, maybe only 10 or 11, they had a paddle board or some kind of board they'd pull behind, not skis, but a board, and you got up on the board and knelt on it and was pulled around the lake.
Behind a motorized boat.
Yeah, you'd held onto the rope, and the boat pulled you around on this board. Well, I was doing that, and I fell off, but I didn't let go of the rope. And so I just started going deeper and deeper into the water, and everybody in the boat was yelling, "Let go of the rope, let go of the rope." And I couldn't hear him. And finally I just let go, and I was so scared I was going to drown. And when they finally got me out of the water into the boat, my dad was in the boat, and he said something like, "Well, I might as well ride it back in," meaning himself. And I thought he was saying me, "You might as well ride it back in to the dock." And I was like, no, I don't want to get on it again. I don't want to. And he meant himself, and he got on it and rode it back in. But I've always kind of been afraid of my face in the water, and
I didn't know that.
I'm not a good swimmer. I don't like jumping in unless I've covered my nose, and I don't like that feeling of water rushing up your nose. Anyway,
You did a good job not passing that along.
probably.
We all had swimming lessons, and I've always felt really confident and comfortable in the water.
And I loved to water ski when I was younger with Margaret and Brent.
I make Mike nervous how quick I am to just like jump in deep water.
Well, good. I think what I passed on to you guys was it was important to learn to swim,
yeah.
and to take swimming lessons. I think there was one more thing about nature I wanted to mention, but I can't remember now. Oh, Dad used to hunt, and he would bring home a deer that he had killed, and then it had to hang for a few days to, I think they called the term ripen the meat. The meat was more tender if it had hung for a few days. And then we would have to, one night, Dad would say, "Okay, we're cutting up the deer tonight." And he'd already have it skinned. And he would do all the hard cutting with a saw and stuff. And then we had to wrap it. We used freezer wrapper paper, and we'd all sit around the table wrapping and taping up the roasts and the steaks and whatever, and carrying them down to the great big freezer in the basement. And that was our supply of meat for the winter. It's whatever Dad shot. But what I really hated about that, besides just being around all that raw meat, was they'd cut the legs off of the deer and the head and discard them. But sometimes, I think the head didn't even come home sometimes with the body, but the legs would be laying around in the garage, and the boys would play with them. And there's these awful deer legs with the fur still on them and the hooves, and I never liked that. I never liked seeing dead animals, of course. Nobody does. Anyway, that's why when we first started doing our ladies' vacations, Mom and Yolinda and Stacy and I, it was usually camping. Mm-hmm. And then they've kind of digressed now to not camping.
Yeah. To more luxury vacationing.
So the other people I would mention who've influenced me was my Aunt Ruth and Aunt Lana. I got to know them better as I was older, and we used to go up to Aunt Ruth's for our sewing weekend where we'd make a quilt for somebody. But I remembered thinking, if I'm ever on a ventilator in the hospital and someone needs to make decisions about my life, I hope it's Aunt Ruth and Aunt Lana and not my mom. Because my mom would just say, "Oh, the doctors know what's best. We'll do whatever the doctors say." And Aunt Ruth and Aunt Lana would say, oh, we've got to ask second and third opinions. We've got to find out everything we can about what's going on and see what we can do to save her life. And that was Aunt Ruth and Aunt Lana. They were strong women who would ask questions and let you know their opinions about stuff.
And have opinions.
Which was not my mom.
Yeah.
And anyway, I think that I always modeled them. I mean, I love everything about my mom, what a good, gentle person she was. And she was strong in her own way, but not about politics or about
Like
things
more
of the world.
assertive.
They were definitely more assertive. And then the last person I think who's influenced me a lot is Jim. When I met him as a teenager, I think he represented everything I was rebelling about. He had long hair. He was, well, he was educated, but he wasn't done with college. But I knew he was going to go to college and finish his education, and he knew how to ask questions and be assertive and say what he thinks and think outside the box and just everything you're looking for when you're leaving home and going out into the world. And in some ways people say you marry your father figure, and I thought he is so the opposite of my father figure. But then over the years, you start to think, oh, wow, I wish Jim was more like my dad in this way or in that way.
Like what specifically?
I think my dad was very handy around the house, fixer-upper, could build things, and
Just willing to take on any kind of project.
Yeah, and he loved to take us camping, and Jim wasn't really into that
As much.
But just to I kind of felt like I was rebelling by hooking up with him, and I think the only reason my parents let me date him as young as I did was because he was Marion's nephew, Marion Latham, who lived next door to my parents. And my dad went to school, grew up with Marion, and he figured Marion's a good guy, so his nephew must be a good guy. But anyway, there's my life story.
You didn't say the one you said to me earlier about Vietnam.
Oh,
And that was a little bit connected to Jim.
That was more connected to, I think, my patriotism. I don't know. Vietnam was an event that tore you in half. It pulled you one way and it pulled you another way. I mean, for me, of course you support your country and you don't be draft dodgers that run to Canada to hide from the draft. But at the same time, it was such a wrong war. And then after the My Lai massacre, when we found out about this whole village of women and children being shot by our soldiers, it was like, oh, that's a bad war. We've got to get out of Vietnam at any cost, you know. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. It was, like I said, it tore the country in half too. I feel like we did what we could when we had the Vietnamese family come, when we sponsored them and helped them get on their feet here in America. Well, you have any questions?
No, not really. You did a good job. I'm going to stop it.